evening, Dr. Jack Kline, who served in the Army in Vietnam in the Medical Corps. So welcome, Dr. Kline.
Thank you. Applause before I start, so I guess I have to do something right. I am Jack Kline, just as announced, and I grew up in Pine Grove in Schuylkill County. Was fortunate to grow up in a family with traditional American values, hard work, individual responsibility, and the golden rule. After graduating from Pine Grove High School in 1955, I attended Gettysburg College, where I graduated in '59 with a degree in chemistry and pre-med. I then went to University of Pennsylvania to medical school, and that's where I earned my MD degree. After that, I came to York to intern at York Hospital. And near the end of my internship year, I had been accepted into the hospital's medical residency program. But that's when my draft notice arrived. Now, I was married at the time, and I had a 6-month-old son, Peter, who's actually here tonight. Now, he's not nearly as cute as he was when he was 6 months old, but he still makes his dad proud. So, I did attempt to get a deferment so that I could finish my residency training before I served, but that was not to be. So we packed up Peter and Ann, Peter's mom, who's in the back row there. She's the one that did the heavy lifting while I was away playing soldier. In fact, if I really want to admit it, she still does the heavy lifting. So we packed up and headed to San Antonio, Texas, to Medical Field Service School at Fort Brooke. While en route to Texas, for a little history, we heard on the car radio about the Gulf of Tonkin incident. And that was on August 2nd of 1964. North Vietnamese patrol boat attacked the USS Maddox in the Gulf of Tonkin, which was in international waters. Now, there was never any doubt about that activity, and it was well publicized, but the consequential actions that were taken by the U.S. government in the days and the weeks following that remain cloaked in secrecy and confusion and mystery. That was until some classified documents were declassified and publicized. And then it became known that there was compelling evidence that the decisions made by the U.S. government at that time were really what compelled the United States into full aggression or full involvement in the Vietnam War. President Johnson then, without telling Congress what had provoked the North Vietnamese attack on the USS Maddox, he went to Congress, and without telling them that, he accused the North Vietnamese of aggression on the high seas. So what he didn't tell them may or may not have made a difference, but there seems little doubt that the attack on the Maddox was provoked by those clandestine gunboat raids that our South Vietnamese ally was conducting along the coast of North Vietnam. So much for the history lesson. After about 6 weeks at Medical Field Service School in Fort Sam Houston, I headed to Fort Hood, Texas for my first assignment as a battalion surgeon with the 1st Battalion of the 66th Armored Regiment, 2nd Armored Division. And my duty at Fort Hood was really pretty boring. It was seeing healthy young recruits in the dispensary, headaches and sore throats and colds and skin rashes and occasional venereal disease. But the nice thing about it was I was usually done by noon, and with no other defined responsibilities, I would spend the rest of the day at home. So after the long nights of medical school and internship, that was a welcome change. So the medical duty was boring, but the family life was good. A life-changing event occurred for us while at Fort Hood, and that was that our 2nd child, a special needs guy, was born. But that's a whole other story. So in early January, actually at that time, even though I knew about what happened in the Gulf of Tonkin and things were heating up in Vietnam, I had little thought that a tour in Vietnam was in my future, because I knew by that time that I was going to be in a tank battalion, and I thought, of what use could they be in the jungles and rice paddies of Vietnam? So, wrong again. So in early January of '65, the doctors in the other battalions at Fort Hood started to get orders that usually read, "to an undetermined and restricted destination overseas." Now, it really wasn't too much of a mystery where that restricted destination was. But first it was the single guys that got orders. So I thought, well, I'm married and have a kid. Actually, by that time I had 2 kids. So I thought, I'm probably going to ride it out right here. But then the next thing that happened was that some of the married guys without kids got orders. And then next, the married guys with kids started to get orders. So it really became a tense waiting game, waiting to find out when your number was going to come up. And the way I found out that I had gotten orders, I was in a dispensary interviewing a patient. I was sitting on this side of the desk, the patient was on that side of the desk. The door to the hallway was like back there. And one of my good friends who had gotten his orders a week before that, and we always said that happiness is when it's the next guy that gets orders for Vietnam. So Stormy comes to the door, and with a throat-cutting gesture, he points to me and he says, "You got the axe." So that's how I knew that I was getting an all-expenses-paid trip to Southeast Asia. My orders indicated an assignment to the 41st Civil Affairs Company, headquartered in Fort Gordon, Georgia, with that famous phrase, "for further movement to a restricted area overseas." Again, no mystery where that was. So at Fort Gordon, our team was divided into 16 teams. Our team was Team 16. And each of the teams consisted of 6 men. There was a team leader who was billed as a civil affairs specialist. In our case, he happened to be an old Green Beret with absolutely no training or special expertise in civil affairs. Each team had an assistant civil affairs specialist, in our case, a lawyer, who also had no training or expertise in civil affairs. There was a physician on each team, and as far as I know, all of the physicians had been to medical school. And to round out the team, we had an engineer, and we had a Spec 5 medic, and we had an interpreter. And wouldn't you know, he didn't know a single word of Vietnamese. So after several weeks of training at Fort Gordon and a chartered commercial airplane ride to Los Angeles, the 41st Civil Affairs Company boarded the USNS General Leroy Eltinge, our new home for the next 26 days as we chugged across the Pacific.
Can I ask you which one you were?
Excuse me?
Can I ask you which one you were?
In the
In that
picture.
picture?
Yep. Oh, yeah.
The one in the middle in the front.
Oh, you're right.
Why, you think I look younger then?
No, I thought you were the one on the right.
Oh. He was our lawyer. The one on the right was our lawyer.
He wasn't tall enough.
The one on the left in the front was our team leader. He was an old Green Beret. In the back, the one on the back left was our engineer. In the middle was our Spec 5 medic. And on the right was our interpreter. Now, he did know French, but no Vietnamese. A lot of Vietnamese knew French, so taking the medical history going from Vietnamese to French to English, and then from English to French to Vietnamese was quite a feat. Actually, it really didn't work very well. This was our stateroom on the Eltinge. We had 10 of us crammed in there. Initially, we had all our luggage, so that the guy on the bottom bunk, we had to move the luggage out in the hall till he got in bed, then we moved the luggage back in. But after a time, they took the luggage down in the hold, and the poor enlisted guys down in the hold, their bunks were so close together that if they would roll over and lay on their side, their shoulder would be pushing on the bunk above them. So I guess we didn't really have it too bad. So on Christmas Eve of 1965, we arrived in the Saigon harbor. Some troops of other companies offloaded there. And then Christmas Day, we had the military version of a Christmas dinner as we went back down the Saigon River and eventually up along the coast in a train where all of the 41st Civil Affairs Company went ashore. Nobody was really able to tell us exactly what our mission would be. We knew that the 41st Civil Affairs Company was the first Vietnamese unit with sole mission for civic activity. But exactly what that meant, nobody was really either able or willing to tell us. They did say that somehow we were to improve the lives of the South Vietnamese and bolster their confidence in the South Vietnamese government. In one briefing, we were even told, when we put these teams together, we really didn't know how they would be utilized. So we're going to just have to experiment. That was reassuring. The problem was with these civic action plans that seemed like there was no liaison between the people that came up with the plans in the U.S. and those on the ground in Vietnam who had to decide how to utilize them. Now, our team was attached to the Marines at the 3rd MAF in Da Nang. By the time we deployed to Da Nang, I had been in country for about a month. I hadn't seen even one patient and did not have a single bit of medical equipment or supplies. I did enjoy the nice white sandy beaches of Nha Trang. Other than that, I pretty much got the runaround trying to get medical supplies. I was told by several people in high places, you know, where to go to get them. But everywhere I went, I was greeted with 41st Civil Affairs Company. We never heard of them. Or, oh, well, we'd like to help. We're not really authorized to give you any supplies. So finally, getting frustrated, I called the MACV headquarters in Saigon. MACV stands for Military Assistance Command Vietnam. And I talked to the MACV surgeon there. So he said, well, you just hitch a ride down to Saigon here and look me up and we'll take care of you. So I went and I came back empty-handed. So about this time I was thinking, this is not really why I spent those grueling years in medical school and internship, but it sure was a lesson on military bureaucracy. Now, when we finally did deploy to Da Nang, and we signed in up there in headquarters, we were told that they would provide billeting for us. Oh, You're an Army unit. We're not authorized to do that for you. So we went downtown Da Nang and found ourselves a pretty nice, comfortable house, which turned out to be our home for the duration that we were in Da Nang. Now the Marines, they had no idea how we were to be utilized. But they said, oh, maybe you can accompany us on some tactical missions. We've never had a doctor along before. That would really be a luxury. So in the meantime, while waiting to see whether we'd be called to go out on any operations, we began doing some MedCap visits. MedCap stands for Medical Civic Action Program. We started to do some visits into surrounding villages and orphanages with sick call, and when available, when we could scrounge it up, we'd take food along to give to the village chief to distribute to his people. And when we could get them, we'd take toys and clothing for the children. Looks like I'm pushing the wrong button there.
Wrong way.
Bottom. This was typical of some of the villages that we visited. And here we're setting up for sick call. Fortunately, I did have two very resourceful enlisted men, and the supplies that you see there were things that they had scrounged up from other units. Here we managed to get a truckload of bulgur wheat that we were going to deliver to the villages, and that's my medic riding shotgun on the top of the pile of bulgur wheat. When we went into the villages, we were very often invited to have a meal with the village chief. Well, sea rations weren't all that good, but usually what we had in those meals ran way inferior to what we had in sea rations. You really couldn't refuse though and go off somewhere in a corner and eat your sea rations, because that really was an affront to the village chief. So usually we did manage to sit down with them and eat what they had to offer. That's my left, and my Vietnamese Army counterpart, Dr. Phat. He would often accompany us into the villages. And I was always glad when he did, because he was very fluent in English, and he did a much better job of acting as interpreter than our interpreter did. Here we're in an orphanage, distributing some toys and clothing and usually some candy that we had for the children. Most of those kind of things that we got, the toys, the clothing, the foodstuffs, Most of that came either from USAID, which is United States Agency for International Development, or from the Catholic Relief Society, which both of those organizations were very active in Vietnam. Here I'm examining a patient at the orphanage, and while I was doing that, the rest of the team were usually out distributing the other goodies that we had brought along. This was a class, a school class of the children in the orphanage, and a better behaved, sweeter group of small children you've never seen. They were so well behaved and so mannerly. Most of them were victims of their parents having been killed in the war. So, it wasn't but a couple days till we were notified that we were going to be going out on an operation with the Marines. Still, the medical supplies that I had were only the few things that had been scrubbed by our medic and the interpreter, the enlisted guys. They were very resourceful. We were told that, oh, when you get out in the field, you'll have everything you need. Well, I had really heard that before. So after an early morning helicopter ride in the dense fog, I found myself in a muddy potato field near the operation headquarters, putting up my pup tent and digging a foxhole beside it. I still had only a few medical supplies, but the good news was that the next day, a huge box of medical supplies arrived. The bad news was that the canvas cover on it was torn, and most everything inside was wet and moldy. There were some antibiotics in there. There was penicillin. It was powdered penicillin in a vial that had to have sterile water injected to mix up the powder. But there was no sterile water. So those vials of penicillin were of zero value. It wasn't long at the headquarters of the operation headquarters till we were told that this operation is producing thousands of refugees. They're all being housed up in Duc Pho. So after another helicopter ride, we arrived in Duc Pho, and there was a MACV compound, a MACV team of 5 guys, the senior advisor of whom had just been killed in an ambush shortly before we got there. And This was a barbed wire enclosed compound with the Viet Cong enclave around it. The thousands of refugees that we were told were there turned out to be just a couple hundred. And that couple hundred had actually been there well before the operation started, and there were no refugees that had been produced by the Operation Double Eagle. So having little else to do, we did some sick call on the refugees that were there, and even did some for the Viet Cong that had been captured and were imprisoned on the compound. The security of the compound was provided by the Popular Forces. Popular Forces were basically a civilian militia, and they were not really known for their willingness to engage in the fight. So every night we'd hear gunfire around the perimeter of the compound, which we pretty much ignored because usually it was just one of the Popular Forces guys getting a little nervous and firing off some rounds into the sugarcane field. One night, however, the firing got a little bit more intense. The intensity increased and it got closer. And I was still fairly content to ignore it until one of the combat-hardened sergeants of the MACV team approached my bunk, shook me, and said, "Doc, you better get your ass out of bed, get your helmet on and your boots and your flak jacket and get into the bunk." And then he proceeded to hand me a carbine with 3 loaded banana clips taped together. And I then thought, well, I guess maybe this is serious. Because Doc shouldn't have a gun because he might hurt himself or somebody else. So when he went to great pains to know how I could know how to use that, I thought I better listen. So it was just about then that the new advisor that had placed Captain Rod, who was one that was killed in the ambush, he got on the radio and he called out to the one of the naval ships offshore and called in some illuminating flares. After which he adjusted the coordinates, and then he made another call to one of the Operation Artillery units. And after that, about 37 rounds bombarded the sugarcane fields all around the compound. And after that, the night was totally quiet. After having seen, I think it's probably fair to say, nothing but bureaucratic screw-ups so far in my military experience, the competence of that military unit surely gained my admiration, because there certainly was the potential that our compound was going to be overrun. So after several more days there, the Operation Double Eagle was winding down, and we were on our way back to Da Nang. So back in Da Nang, the team resumed our trips to the villages and the orphanages, doing sick call and passing out goodies when we could obtain them. But those village trips really took up only a few days a week, maybe half days for the most part. So I had lots of free time with no defined responsibility. I was determined to find something meaningful to do. And it was just about then that I discovered that in Da Nang, just a couple blocks from our billet, were two hospitals. One was a surgical hospital, the other was a medical hospital. I first visited the surgical hospital, and this was a common scene where there were multiple patients in a single bed. These three kids had been wounded in gunfighting in one of their villages. There was a team of civilian volunteer surgeons at that surgical hospital, led by Dr. McInnes, who was the chief of surgery at the University of Georgia. And he was willing to turn over some of the medical care of the surgical patients to me, but the disruption of my having to go out on the field operations with the Marines precluded my involvement there. So, still determined to find something meaningful to do. Although the surgical hospital was not really modern by any means, it was clean and had the basics. But I was not prepared for what I found at the medical hospital. This is the entrance to the Da Nang City Hospital compound. This is the hospital itself. It's a one-story building with a bunch of concrete steps leading up to the entranceway. The windows were all open, and the abundance of flies on the inside attested to the fact that there were no screens on the windows. The floors were unpainted concrete, and the walls had been painted white, but they were streaked with red-brown stains anywhere betel nut juice had been spit against the walls. Chewing betel nut was a centuries-old custom in Vietnam. If you visited one of your friends in Vietnam, very likely they'd offer you some betel nut. Just like in our society, you might offer your friend a cup of coffee or beer or a glass of wine. But they really didn't care where they spit the betel nut juice. This is the hospital staff with me in the background there. This is a modern Da Nang City Hospital of today. I never saw that, but I got that photo off of the internet. And this was the inside of our hospital. You can see the staining on the walls. The beds were iron frames with planks on the bed, and usually between each plank there was an inch or two space, and then a bamboo mat was laid on top of it. There was no such things as pillows, very few blankets. Often they just would cover themselves with a bamboo mat. This was one of the lucky patients who had a mattress. I think there were two in the whole house, two mattresses in the whole hospital. She was one of the lucky ones. This was a patient with cholera. You can see that she's on an army cot. Now, most of the cholera patients in their beds, beds, with the spaces between those wooden planks, one of the prime symptoms of cholera is profuse watery diarrhea. Hope you've all had dinner. But the spaces between those planks served a very useful purpose. It allowed all of the watery diarrhea of the cholera patients to flow onto the floor. But have no fear, a couple times a day, somebody would come along with a bucket of water, throw the water on the floor, sweep it all out the door, onto the porch, and down onto the ground below. This lady had a modern device. She had an army cot that had a hole cut in the bottom with a bucket underneath. I'm not kidding you. It's just really hard to believe. But that was somebody's invention, and I guess they thought they wouldn't have to sweep the floors off them if they caught it in a bucket.
Was that curable, cholera?
Huh?
Was that curable?
Is cholera cure? Yeah, the big problem with cholera is the diarrhea. And I mean, you can lose gallons of fluid a day with the diarrhea. So if you keep up with the fluid replacement, and some antibiotics are useful, but the main thing is replacing the fluid loss.
Our problem was dysentery. We got a big problem with dysentery when I was over there at 69.
I'm sorry?
We had dysentery. That's when you drink
Oh,
impure water, and
Yeah.
it feels like water's coming out of your butt.
yeah, that's,
It wasn't good.
you might as well have had cholera. You might have got more time off.
We didn't get off for that.
This was the hospital sterilizer. Now the problem with that was that the heating unit didn't produce enough heat to boil the water. But you did what you could with what you had. This was the kitchen in a hospital. That certainly could have used a little remodeling and modernization. But nonetheless, they did manage to prepare some meals there. Usually was rice, and I'm not sure what that vegetable is being served. But one of the things was that the patients didn't really have to spend much time choosing from the menu what they were going to have for dinner. And I didn't have to spend any time trying to figure out what diet to prescribe. When I had visited the hospital the first time and saw what it was like, the civilian Vietnamese doctor that I met there, he was really eager for help. And in this country, credentialing can go on forever. You have to fill out all sorts of forms and get all sorts of references. All he needed was to see the caduceus on my uniform collar. And he offered me the 37-bed unit to manage as I saw fit. If I had to go out on a mission with the Marines, he said, he'd cover for me. Now, I had adequate free time from any official duties. And I knew that my team leader, because I had talked to him about how I wanted to get involved in doing some things in the hospital, I knew he was okay with the idea. But I never asked permission from the commanding officer. Better to ask forgiveness, I thought, than to ask for permission, which might be refused. So from then until a few weeks before I left Vietnam, I spent a large part of every day and often full days at the hospital seeing patients. And of course, this was in a role that was totally unrelated to any of my official responsibilities, and that really had not even been sanctioned by the command. The conditions were primitive, and believe me, the diagnostic resources of X-ray and lab were virtually non-existent. Many of the patients were really very sick, and many had diseases that I had never encountered during my training. I knew that I could ask if I had a surgical situation, I could ask for help from the surgical team that was at the surgical hospital. But as far as anything else, I was pretty much on my own. And I thought to myself, okay, you really wanted to do something that might be meaningful, make a difference, might require some medical skills other than passing out aspirin and antacids and soap in the villages. So here's your chance. When I looked around that ward at all those really sick people with diseases that I had never encountered, knew very little about, I couldn't help but think, am I really up to this? And where in the hell am I going to start? This was one of the very sick patients. This fellow had tetanus with lockjaw. First patient and the last patient in my entire career that I ever saw with tetanus. He did not survive. This young lady had typhoid fever, and she was accompanied, this is the same patient, with her brother by her bedside. Many of the patients had a family advocate that would come in, and some of them would stay there, as he did, 24 hours a day. He would spend hours fanning the flies away from her face, and then at night he would go out and sleep on the porch. We sometimes forget how good we had it here. There's two other patients in my ward. The one in the front had another typhoid fever. The one in the back had bubonic plague. Whoops. This was one of my patient successes. The young lady in the center there, Fan Tree Trum. She was a 16-year-old girl who came into the hospital in severe congestive heart failure. She had obvious valvular heart disease, probably from rheumatic fever, with some diuretics, and digitalis was really about all we had for heart failure. I was able to get her a little bit better compensated. Her shortness of breath improved, and we got rid of some of the edema. But it was really pretty clear that unless she had something definitive done, her long-term prognosis for any kind of meaningful life was really pretty grim. So at the time, the USS Repose hospital ship was offshore. So I was able to make arrangements to have her seen on the hospital ship. And interestingly enough, they had a portable heart-lung machine there that could be operated with batteries. It was about the size of a suitcase. And I never knew what happened to her never got any follow-up. I tried to make arrangements to get out to the repose myself, so I not only wanted to see how she was doing, but I wanted to see the facilities on the repose. And that never materialized. So by the time I left and got home, I had no idea what happened to her. And one day I picked up Time magazine, and lo and behold, there was her picture, recovering from some successful heart surgery on the USS Repose. So, though I had probably more failures than successes, though I had really little to do with the actual curative treatment, I consider her one of my successes. This is a picture of the Tonsanute Airport. I had been transferred with 23 days left of my tour. I had been transferred to the 1st Infantry Division. They decided to take the physicians off of the civil affairs teams. And the luck of my draw was the 1st Infantry Division, where fortunately I ended up in the headquarters medical battalion. So at this point, I only had a short time left before my tour was up. My duty at 1st Infantry Division was about the same as it had been at Fort Hood, seeing healthy young recruits with sore throats and colds and backache. And there was a lot of venereal disease. And as I said, I didn't really see combat injuries unless that young fella who got drunk and ended up with a bullet in his pelvis when he was having an encounter in a house of ill repute. Maybe you can consider that a combat injury. So finally, on April 26th, or I mean on July 26th, I had orders for McGuire Air Force Base in continental United States as my next assignment. So we left from Tonsanute Airport, which was, at one time during the war, was the busiest airport in the world. This Army captain, who was not part of our unit, but he had adopted this 7-year-old girl from one of the orphanages and was taking her home with him for a better life in the United States. And they accompanied us on our flight out of Vietnam. This is one of my favorite slides. Heading for home. Goodbye, Vietnam, and hello, America. It was supposed to be an hour, but I think 15 minutes of that was supposed to be for questions. And I've used up that 15 minutes, but I'll still take some questions.
What unit were you in, with the Marines in around Da Nang? You remember? 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines?
With the Marines?
Yeah, you know, remember what your unit, what the unit was?
All I know, it was a unit out of the 3rd Marine Amphibious Force
Oh, okay.
headquarters. But exactly what unit it was that I hung out in that muddy potato field with, I'm not even sure.
Did you take something from Vietnam when you got back on how lucky you were to live in this country versus over there?
Well, I guess, you know, for many Vietnam vets that came back, as most of you know, their homecoming was really compromised by anti-war protests, some of which got pretty personal and pretty vicious. Fortunately, I really didn't have any of that. I had a family waiting for me. I had a spot in the residency that I could immediately resume my training. And after I finished my training, I practiced private practice of medicine for 29 years before I joined the WellSpan Medical Group, where I co-founded Apple Hill Internal Medicine, which is a faculty type practice with a heavy emphasis on teaching, where I really enjoyed contact with interns, residents, and medical students. So finally on, I guess it was 2002, I retired from full time. But after that, I did a few years of teaching on the WellSpan faculty before finally retiring completely. I think I retired completely in 2002. And I retired to a world with no night call, no weekends, and no holidays.
Jack, I assume that when someone is suddenly like you, and of course many others, are suddenly thrust into something so dramatically different from your usual world, with the possibility of all the suffering that you see creating enormous emotions that most people, from what I read or heard, are able to just somehow or another push it down and not let it get to them. But I'm wondering, with all that you saw and went through, how it affected you.
Well, you know, I really didn't go through what the troops on the patrols went through. I was in some scary situations, but not those gut-wrenching, life-changing situations that many of the troops were in, you know, day after day.
But the hospital wasn't exactly a picnic either.
No, it wasn't a picnic. That's right. And for a good bit of the time, I was over my head with some of those things because I had never seen it. I hadn't encountered most of those diseases. And today, it probably would be easier with the internet. But that wasn't the case then.
Did you have access to any medical library type of information? So you really didn't have any
Nothing at the hospital. I had taken a couple books along. I had a book on tropical diseases that I took along and tried to read on
So you were
the
kinda
ship
stuck
on the
with
way
that.
over. So
What were the beetle nuts? What plant were they from, or what tree? I've seen the people chewing beetle nuts for a year and the charcoal stained teeth. But did they have a narcotic effect on the
They
people?
did. They had a mild narcotic effect. But how they were grown or what they came from, I don't know. And I managed to finish my tour without having stained teeth from beetle nut.
Can I add something that I've always thought was interesting that you told, us years ago, was that when it got to be the weekend, everybody's meds were wrapped in newspaper?
Yeah, the first Friday that I visited, or the first Friday that after I started to work there, the first Friday that I was there, on the lower corner of all of the beds, there were these little packages wrapped in newspaper. And I wondered what that was. I inquired, what's with all these newspaper packages? Oh, they're the medicines for the weekend. Probably a family member will come in and administer them. On the weekends, the nurses were pretty much absent. Another thing that was a frustration was in the middle of the afternoon, no matter how chaotic things were on the ward or how busy they were, the nurses all disappeared. It was siesta time, and nothing interfered with siesta time. So 45 minutes or so, they were back. And I mean, just the difference in the culture, it blows your mind. We really don't know. We really don't know how lucky we have it here.
How did that help you, like when you came back, knowing what was there and what you had to deal with, whatever, when you finished your residency and started working, what did you take away from that? Like, you're used to not having things. Did you become more resourceful in knowing that you didn't have the CAT scans, you didn't have x-rays or whatever when you were treating these people? Did you rely on your instincts when you came back to the United States?
Well, to a certain extent, I think you do that anyway. You certainly had to rely on that over there, so that probably made me more cognizant of the importance of understanding what certain physical diagnosis findings meant, and I certainly had the opportunity to experience many physical diagnosis findings that you don't see in this country. Like that patient that I showed with tetanus, he had classical lockjaw. And I've never seen a lockjaw tetanus patient in this country. I don't know, some other docs in the audience here, did you ever see one, Ron?
On John Atkins' cousin.
Yeah. Really?
Yeah, I was involved in that too. Yeah.
And it was probably while you were over there.
Yeah.
Do you see any cases of malaria? It was pretty prevalent when I was over there.
It was, but no, in the hospital there, I really didn't see that. And even on the sick calls, I really didn't see much malaria. Something else that was really conspicuous by its absence was coronary artery disease, symptoms of coronary artery disease, angina, and heart attacks. I didn't see a single heart attack the time I was over there. Likewise, strokes. Didn't see any strokes.
Probably because of their diet.
Could be.
There's two types of malaria, falciparum, which is the worst, which I had in Vietnam, and then Vivex, I got that on my way home. But I passed out on guard duty down in DC 3 months later. But that was a milder case of malaria, the Vivex, and your temperature only gets up to 102. But I can remember waiting on the chopper the first time to take me up out on the USS Sanctuary. I had a field jacket on. It was over 100 degrees outside, and I was freezing. My temperature was 106. Yeah. So they put me in ice, a bed of ice for 35 days.
Oh, man.
Obviously, you survived it.
Yes, I did.
And became a runner.
Yep,
And a
it made me
wrestler.
stronger.
In Da Nang, the home, the house that your team stayed in, is that a government property? Or did the team have to reimburse a Vietnamese family for the rent of that building?
You know, to this day, I don't know.
Okay.
What I do know is that there were several naval officers on the first floor. So we always assumed that it was financed or whatever by the Navy. But we managed to get the top floor, and the whole time we were there, we kept waiting for the shoe to drop for somebody to come and tell us that, hey, you're Army, you can't be in this unit. But fortunately, that never happened.
Thank you.
Jack, it sounds from your presentation you were involved mostly in the medical care of the local population. And if that's the case, were you aware of that going over, that you were dealing more with the local population medical care than the military?
I guess yes and no. I mean, we knew that our mission was somehow to provide services to civilians. The idea being to make them more appreciative of their government. So,
yeah, that was called pacification. That's what we used when I was over there.
Pacification
Yeah.
programs, yeah.
Going into the village, we had a number of people, like 1 or 2 people, go into a village and stay there for months and help the people.
Yeah, we didn't stay in fact,
Well, that was early
when
on.
we go out, when some of the villages that we were helicoptered into, to this day, I hate the sound of a helicopter because it brings back memories.
That's called a trigger.
Except when they would drop us off and we'd do our thing with sick call or whatever, and then they were scheduled to come back and pick us up. There was always some anxious moments till you heard that thing whir to come in and get you, because the last place you wanted to be was there by yourself overnight. So that was the one time that I enjoyed hearing it. But most of the other times on those helicopter rides, I was going somewhere where I didn't really want to be. The first helicopter ride I had was on that operation Double Eagle in the dense fog early in the morning, and I was seated right aside of the gunner at the door. And to this day, I think that the gunner's blast when we took off was meant to scare the hell out of me. and it did just exactly that. Any other questions? How many of you, you're a Vietnam vet, right? Any other Vietnam vets here? So you guys, I'm sure, had it tougher than I did.
I was a grunt.
What?
I was a grunt. That's infantry. I was in the same area you were in. I was around Da Nang, Quang Nam province, and we patrolled around An Hoa, our fire base, and Rich Burton behind me was in Army intelligence in An Hoa. and he was working for 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines.
I am proud to say that I never was the point man on a patrol.
You get used to it. Your body becomes numb.
But you know, it seemed clear in the troops that we came in contact with that the 18, 19, 20-year-olds, I mean, those guys thought they were invincible. A lot of the commanders, I think, really loved those guys.
That was the
How old were you when you were in?
19.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the average age was 19, 20. Which was good because of the weather and everything. You had to be in pretty good shape. I carried 120 pounds on my back for 3 months as a radio man when I first got over there. So. But luckily I was athletic, so I could endure it up to a point.
Did everybody carry 120 pounds? All those guys going out in the field?
But no, it was only certain people. That was with all the batteries that the radio required and all your food. You had 2 days worth of chow. You had canteens. You had tripwire. You had grenades. You carried a lot of things in your pack.
Yeah, okay.
A lot of people don't realize that. I didn't have a camera the whole time in Vietnam because I didn't have room for it, and I wasn't worried about a camera.
No on the priority list.
Anything else?
In Da Nang, you showed a village that you went out to. That was a Vietnamese village. Did you get to see any mountain yard villages?
No. They were.
I know, I was outside of Pleiku, the 4th Infantry Division, and around our compound, there was a lot of, it was mostly mountain yard people.
No, I had no contact with them. Okay, well, thank you all for listening. I just heard today that the